If you look over the history of regulation, say railroad regulation, financial regulation, and so on, you find that quite commonly it's either initiated by the economic concentrations that are being regulated, or it's supported by them. And the reason is because they know that sooner or later they can take over the regulators. And it ends up with what's called regulatory capture. The business being regulated is in fact running the regulators. Bank lobbyists are actually writing the laws of financial regulation. It gets to that extreme. And that's been happening through history, and again, it's a pretty natural tendency when you just look at the distribution of power. One of the things that expanded enormously in the 1970s is lobbying, as the business world moved sharply to try to control legislation. The business world was pretty upset by the advances in public welfare in the 60s, and in particular by Richard Nixon. It's not too well understood, but he was the last New Deal president, and they regarded that as class treachery. In Nixon's administration, you get the consumer safety legislation, safety and health regulations in the workplace, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Business didn't like it, of course. They didn't like the high taxes, they didn't like the regulation, and they began a coordinated effort to try to overcome it. Lobbying sharply increased. Deregulation began with a real ferocity. There were no financial crashes in the 50s and the 60s because the regulatory apparatus of the New Deal was still in place. As it began to be dismantled under business pressure and political pressure, you get more and more crashes. And it goes on right through the years. 70s sort of starts to begin. 80s really takes off.
Congress was asked to approve federal loan guarantees to the auto company of up to $1.5 billion.
Now, all of this is quite safe as long as you know the government's going to come to your rescue. So take, say, Reagan. Instead of letting them pay the costs, Reagan bailed out the banks like Continental Illinois, the biggest bailout of American history at the time. Actually ended his term with a huge financial crisis, the savings and loan crisis, and the government moved in and bailed it out.
President Bush today signed the $300 billion savings and loan bailout bill.
In 1999, regulation was dismantled to separate commercial banks from investment banks. Then comes the Bush, then Obama bailout.
Bear Stearns is running to the feds to stay afloat.
President Bush today defended the decision to bail out Citigroup. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have asked for a total of $3 billion more. This bailout could get much bigger, signaling deepening troubles for the U.S. economy.
And they're building up the next one. Each time, the taxpayer is called on to bail out those who created the crisis, increasingly the major financial institutions. In a capitalist economy, you wouldn't do that. In a capitalist system, that would wipe out the investors who made risky investments. But the rich and powerful, they don't want a capitalist system. They want to be able to run to the nanny state as soon as they're in trouble and get bailed out by the taxpayer. That's called too big to fail. I mean, there are Nobel laureates in economics who significantly disagree with the course that we're following. People like Joseph Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, others. And none of them were even approached. The people picked to fix the crisis were those who created it. The Robert Rubin crowd, the Goldman Sachs crowd, they created the crisis, are now more powerful than before. Is that accident? Well, not when you pick those people to create an economic plan. I mean, what do you expect to happen? Meanwhile, for the poor, let market principles prevail. Don't expect any help from the government. The government's the problem, not the solution, and so on. That's essentially neoliberalism. And it has this dual character which goes right back in economic history. One set of rules for the rich, opposite set of rules for the poor. There's nothing surprising about this. It's exactly the dynamics you'd expect. And if the population allows it to proceed, it's just going to go on and on like this until the next crash, which is so much expected that credit agencies, which kind of evaluate the status of firms, are now counting into their calculations the taxpayer bailout that they expect to come after the next crash, which means that the beneficiaries of these credit ratings, like the big banks, they can borrow money more cheaply, they can push out smaller competitors, and you get more and more concentration. Everywhere you look, policies are designed this way, which should come as absolutely no surprise to anyone. That's what happens when you put power into the hands of a narrow sector of wealth, which is dedicated to increasing power for itself, just as you'd expect.